Well, Lally, first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to do this from lovely, sleepy Dorset, I hope, where I'm sure you're surrounded by beautiful gardens, and to talk about all the work that you've done. And I'd just like to comment that in these days of tension and people tying themselves up in knots and getting very concerned about how life is, to hear this remarkable story of how you recount gardens helping people deal with conflict as an extraordinary therapeutic way of rebuilding their lives is quite marvelous. For those of you on this call, thank you for joining us. As Andrew has said, Larry is a winning freelance journalist, writer and filmmaker, and she's covered war and unrest in the Middle East and Afghanistan since 2007, and actually lived in Kabul for over 5 years. When she was there, she worked for a variety of publications, which included the Sunday Times, the FT, the Telegraph, and Granta, to name but a few. She's also worked, as she will tell us, in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, Eastern Ukraine, Bangladesh, Jordan, and Iraq. And this, her first book, War Gardens, was published a couple of years ago and explores current conflicts, although through the peaceful art of gardening. This is a wonderful story, and I'm now going to ask Lally if she would take us through the story, and then, as Andrew said, at the end, we'll start asking some more questions. So Lally, without further ado, over to you.
Well, I'll just briefly run through what War Gardens is. It's not actually a book about gardening, and I'm not a gardener. But as Woody, as you said, through my sort of 20s and early 30s, I worked as a foreign correspondent in foreign places, Afghanistan, Middle East, Asia, Southeast Asia, and I was sort of covering every sort of traditional kind of story in terms of the visual impact of what you can do. I was trained as a photojournalist. So this is in Gaza in 2009, in Iraq in 2008, Bangladesh in 2007, Afghanistan in 2010, and again Afghanistan in 2010. And when you're working on images like this, you're in the moment, it's all very exciting. But the reason I became a journalist was to try and create change, to try and create empathy, and to make people understand what's going on in these foreign places. And I really began to doubt that what I was doing had any value. And it's very, very common. We see it everywhere. It's in some computer games, it's in the newspapers, it's on the news every day, and it's on our smartphones. So it's really, I think, it's slightly become sort of prosaic. And I myself was becoming quite inured to the situations I was finding myself in. And I thought that was shocking in itself, because to find war normal is not a good, that's not a normal thing. So I wanted to turn the idea of traditional war reporting on its head completely and to try and re-narrate war through something counterintuitive. Now, I'm not the first person to do this. Monet in 2000 in 1914 to 16, he worked on his Agapanthus triptych. And there's the finest examples of Monet's impressionism. People flock to his gardens every year to see what Monet saw for himself. But what they don't realize is that he painted these while his own son was fighting, his stepson was fighting on the front lines of the First World War, just 50 kilometers away from where he was painting. And actually his paintings were his own patriotic contribution to the war effort, because while all his neighbors fled for safety to get away from Giverny, Monet stayed put to paint. And this is another one of his works, the water lilies, and not that was the weeping willow. And it's, again, the painter's use of sort of form and color and texture is completely hailed as this remarkable example of impressionism, yet it's a direct response to mourning, because the weeping willow, of course, is a sign of mourning. So by and large, I'm not saying I'm not the first person to try and do something in a different way. I was on assignment in Afghanistan in 2010, and I decided to stay for a few years because I got lots of work and it was an interesting place to be. I covered every sort of aspect of the conflict, from security with military embeds to civilian casualties in hospitals to suicide blasts in supermarkets. And what I was really struck by was how the Afghans, although they're a nation of of warlike people think of them as being very warlike. They're actually really trees at the sides of roads going up into the Hindu Kush mountains. You've got every compound has a garden full of, ornamental flower beds and roses and vine-covered pergolas. And it was really a remarkable thing. And often when you find yourself very far from home, working in a dangerous place, a garden can be as comforting really as the night sky. And there's something quite lovely about finding yourself in a garden in a hostile place. And this is also sort of where the idea of combining the idea of this incredibly violent conflict going on around you, and yet people still found time to garden. So that's really where I sort of started to investigate the idea of gardening in a state of conflict. This is one of the first gardeners I met actually in 2012. I'd lived in Kabul for a couple of years, and I'd heard about this guy in the old city of Muradkhani. And he's called Ramesh, and he is sitting here in a very small courtyard garden that he built on a bit of scrap land, which apparently he may or may not have stolen from some elders. But he's sitting here in his walled garden, and he has a wall of canary cages behind him. And I actually sort of got to know him quite well over the years, just because he was just one of these old guys that I used to see and say hi to. And the local sort of elders used to kind of mock him a little bit because he was always slightly down on his luck. But I actually sort of approached him and latterly spoke to him. And he had a very sad sort of story, really, because he lived with his wife's parents, which in Afghanistan is unusual. Your wife would live with your parents, you would live with your parents and your wife would join you. But his life used to be actually he was quite affluent before the civil war and the invasion of the Russians. His father was a white-collar worker in an agricultural bank, and they lived in a large house with capacious gardens full of vines, and there was an orchard, there were peach trees and lots of birds. But of course they lost it all in the sort of the 30 years of conflict that seen the destruction of Afghanistan. And Ramesh himself was orphaned, he was estranged from his siblings, and as far as he is aware, the house no longer exists, but there is a road in its place. And he built this tiny walled garden as a way of regaining something from his old life. And he can be found there every day. If I were to be sort of shot into Afghanistan right now, I'm pretty sure I could find him there right now, drinking a cup of tea in the late evening sun, smoking and drinking tea, and listening to the canaries on the back wall behind him, which I'm sure he would be dreaming of a time when life was a bit better. One of the last gardeners I met was this chap called Hamidullah. I met him in 2017. He was a 19-year-old pharmacology student in Parwan, which is just outside Kabul city. He was brought up as a refugee in Iran, and returned with his family when he was, I think, 9. As an Afghan millennial, he loves Facebook, watching films, hanging out with his friends, just a normal teenager at university of indiscriminate violence and fear. He said, when I get up in the morning and go to university, I'm scared. Every day I think it must be my last. His family garden, this land around him, is really a means of escapism. When he and his family returned from Iran, his father gave him a wallflower, and from there his love of gardening really grew, no pun intended. And he even prefers studying in his greenhouse than he does to anywhere else. But as we were talking, and when you're working where in a place where the language is not your own, you're using the intermediary or translator, and you have to work quite hard in order to convey what you're trying to get out of somebody, i.e. colour and the details of things, and also quite a long time to get to the essence of Hamidullah, because I had the sense that there was something more that he couldn't quite tell. There was something quite frail and what's the word? There was something very mournful and sorrowful about him. And indeed, after a while, he almost broke down in tears. He didn't quite break down in tears, and he admitted that one of his best friends was a soldier in the Afghan army and was killed in a Taliban suicide bombing on the outskirts of Kabul. And this friend was like a brother to him. And he said, I was so sad when he was killed. I couldn't sleep for grief. I tried to garden to forget him, but in the end, I planted a flower to remember him. And when one grew, it was like I had a new friend. And he was pointing to this geranium plot on his desk when he was speaking. And of course, Helmand is a world away from Kabul. And for we Brits, I think I'm assuming it's mostly British audience here, it's perhaps what we know most about Afghanistan. It is the essence of the war in Afghanistan. It's a semi-medieval place, seemingly lost in time. There we go. You know, in our news vernacular, it's soldiers, guns, dust, deserts, a lot of casualties, a lot of fatalities, and a pretty unpleasant place at times. And there are innocuous Helmandi towns that have now gone down in the annals of British military history. Places where battles happened back when the war was still going on, when we still had soldiers there. But at the forward operating base in Lashkar, which was the capital of Helmand province, the forward operating base team, it was operated by our own forces, the Danes, and I believe Smithsonians were also there, and some special forces people. But this beautiful garden was in the forward operating base, and it was tended to by this man, Ghulam Hazrat. And Gul is Ghulam is a derivative of the word flower. So he's obviously known for his flower-like ways. But gardens were actually started, so he told me, by soldiers in 2006. They were homesick and came out to Afghanistan with some seeds. But of course, soldiers, being soldiers, had to go and do what they do best, which was to fight. And they realized they needed somebody to help look after all these things that they'd started to grow. So they employed Ghulam, and he took it from there. But of course, he didn't read English. And he had these packets of seeds from famous seed companies in the United Kingdom without having a clue of what they were or what they did. And by process of, not elimination, by process of gardening, he worked out which plants like the dry, which plants like sun, shade, etc. And the garden is, this is another corner of it. He sits in this little tent with his seeds in the box behind him, tending to all these different types of plants. And he rather liked seeing the soldiers in the evening sun when there was a bit more peace to the day. But this was taken in 2013, just before the troop withdrawal, and he was facing unemployment and, of course, recriminations from the Taliban from having worked with the coalition forces. But his main concern wasn't impending death; it was actually the garden, because the garden will die without me. I'm losing sleep just thinking about it. I tried to plant flowers that like dry soil, but who else will water them if I'm not here? Helmand, of course, is mostly known for its opium production. 85% of the world's opium still comes from Afghanistan, even now. The Taliban gets much of its funding from the trade. Alternative livelihood programs that DFID have put into place, or USAID or European or Australian counterparts, they've largely failed. Bottom line is that farmers would rather chase the money. Understandably, a yield of harvest from a poppy harvest can give a year's salary in 2 weeks. So why grow watermelons for a year when in 2 weeks you can get $200 or $300 in? You're paid in yield, so they'd be paid in heroin. Helmand is an incredibly poor place where families are living on less than $1 a day. But most people do work in the trade because it's money, and some actually work in it to wage jihad of some form against the invading foreigners, whether they're American or English, or latterly, or a long time ago, Russian. This is Mohammed Payab, who's actually a fairly wealthy man. He's sitting on a discarded military cot bed with his granddaughter, sorry. This was taken in 2014 after all combat troops had left Helmand, and they went down and stayed with their tribesmen. He built a hospital to absorb the excess of civilian. Also built a garden because he was very much aware of the healing effects of the garden on his patients. And here he is sitting in the garden, the last light of the day. He was a very nice man. He's very jolly. He was always slightly slapping his thigh with jokes. He was very benevolent, having built this hospital. And of course, very, very much cared about his country, his province, and his patients. but in a sort of skewed the relationship between Helmandis and the opium traders. He pays for the running of his hospital from money using money that he gets from renting out his fields outside in Gereshk to opium farmers. So if you have to sort of think about like an Escher drawing of steps opening onto doors, opening onto steps, turning upside down. So I have to read it because it gets so muddled in my head. But to clarify, here he is in the garden of a clinic he's built to treat the civilians caught in the crossfire he believes is brought by the presence of international soldiers who are fighting an insurgency funded by the crop he allows to be grown in order to fund the clinic, which obviously then props up the state, the province as a narco state. So this sort of perpetuated cycle of poverty that so many Afghans see is kind of endemic because the opium trade is so strong and so easily grown in Afghanistan. And of course, the irony is really that in a month's time in Britain, we'll remember 453 lives lost in the Afghan war with a poppy in our lapels. And a double irony, I guess, would be that soldiers wounded on the front lines would be given morphine as a first point of pain relief. So there's a poppy is more symbolic than ever. Gaza is very much cut off from the world. Since 2007, Hamas has had complete control over who enters and exits. It is in effect a large open-air prison. The population of just under 2 million this is what Gaza looks like, the Gaza city. There's a population of, the density is around 4,500 people per square kilometre. To put this into perspective, in this country, it's about 420 people per square kilometre. So you really are living cheek by jowl with your neighbours. It's incredibly polluted. There's very little water because Israel has lots of restrictions on water and electricity. There are power outages and food shortages every day. And every couple of years, of course, war breaks. Our screens are then filled with the wars and Palestinians throwing rocks at soldiers and lots of people dying and crying. But in the meantime, between these wars, there's a population of just under 2 million just trying to get on with their lives. And, Gazans are lovely people. They're very ordinary as well. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, very average middle income families live in Gaza, as well as incredibly poor people, incredibly rich people. I interviewed well over a dozen Gazan gardeners, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to introduce you to Isra Ahmed, whose father is a hydroponic gardener and grows pinpoint, take the sort of the middle-ish, the highest tower block. He keeps his garden on one of the tall tower blocks around here. And it's hydroponic gardening is soilless gardening, so using fish waste and drain pipes, out of which he can grow this abundance of vegetables. He started off working for an NGO, being supported by an NGO, and then decided to diversify and expand. But his daughter, I really loved talking to. This was in 2013, so here she was 17. So she's a bit older now. I can't do the math so quickly, but she was really a very sweet girl. And she's wearing for the photograph she had to dress up to be modest, but she was just wearing teenage skinny jeans and a little t-shirt and a Hello Kitty necklace, and she wants to be a doctor. She said, I bring my friends up here, they love it. At night you can see the moon so clearly and it's nice to eat up here. I want to learn as much as possible from my father because older people can teach you a lot about life. When it gets too hot, I like to sit amidst the flowers and study because flowers are hope and life. Life and death live so closely here that you come to realize that very small things can bring you great moments of happiness. Everything stopped during war and you realize that every dream you have belongs to someone else, to the Israelis. But of course, being a foreign correspondent, you can't, it's less, it's suboptimal, as you might say, to be biased. And no matter what you might think about Gaza and Israel and the situation there, it's your duty to be as balanced as possible. So after I was in Gaza, I spent about 2 weeks on the border going viewing gardeners there. This is what Gaza looks like from Israel, that strip in the middle, that very densely populated thing of high rises, and the land outside. This is Israel. You can see the rusty farm vehicles that were sort of used probably from the 20s, I think, because the land around Gaza, that was the kibbutzim that was started there in the early 20th century by socialist Zionists fleeing sort of persecution in Eastern Europe. The kibbutz ideology is very much founded on sort of socialist ideology, and it's to the community really. And the ideology behind it is really entrenched in land and cultivation, and serving your community. In the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of the kibbutzim have kind of surrendered their own identity to being more commercial and expanding into kind of Dead Sea mud factories and tourism. But the ones on the Gazan border are actually still by and large quite traditional. And they of course live in the shadow of these Hamas rockets. Israel has an incredibly sophisticated defense system called the Iron Dome, which stops rockets from exiting, or they explode them in the middle of the sky. And it alerts anyone within the vicinity that there's a rocket about to come. And every kibbutz member is given a bomb shelter. Now I met Esti, who was a very sprightly 70-year-old when we met, and she refused to actually go in her bomb shelter because she thought it was too oppressive. And instead she grew flowers over it. And she said, of course, it's scary when there's an attack, but when there's shelter in the garden, but if the shelter is part of the garden's the safest place I can be. When you come and work with the flowers, all the rubbish from the world just melts away. She said, I want peace and quiet, and the people of Gaza want that too. They're good people just like we are and have the same daily hopes, fears and dreams that we have, and just like the rest of the world has. And she really reminded me that the situation between Gaza is really not personal. So many people I interviewed had friends that were cut off in Gaza, and they kept on asking me about the situation there, and vice versa. Gazans asked me about where their friends might be in Israel. The West Bank is another part of the conflict in the Middle East, of course, very entrenched, very entrenched in the whole Gaza situation, but also incredibly different. The West Bank is divided into 3 areas, A, B, and C. I won't go into the details because it's incredibly complicated and political. But all you need to know is that Area C is administered by the Israelis, but sadly lived in by most Palestinians. And it's the largest contiguous area of land, but it's the most volatile because it's where a lot of illegal settlers are being sent by the government, or they're settling of their own accord. Maybe I don't think they're actually settling on their own accord, but they are, Palestinian villages are being destroyed by settlers who are going in and taking over basically. And it's a much harder place to be unbiased because of this. When you're interviewing illegal settlers who talk about the fact that there was nothing here and now there is, and they've just knocked over a Palestinian village and there are 50 people who are completely homeless, it's very easy to get quite cross about it. But I'll introduce you just to 2 gardeners in the West Bank who garden for very different reasons. This is Mohammed Abu Habsa, who I met in a permanent refugee camp just outside Jerusalem called Kalindia. And he was sort of a retired freedom fighter. I think he's been on a lot of American watch lists as well for terrorism charges. He's been in solitary confinement, seen the inside of every prison. He's been on death row. He's been pardoned. He said that solitary confinement was by far and away the worst. He was under house arrest when he became interested in gardening. It was in the early 2000s during one of the intifadas, I think it was the first. And when the soldiers guarding him sort of caught up in going off to fight in the intifada against the intifada, he was able to go into his garden. He's a very wealthy man, and he was able to divide up his garden into crops, which he gave to save for his own family, gave a third away to the poor, and reinvested a third into the next rotation of arable plants. I was getting ahead of myself now. When we met, he'd all but given up on gardening. So we met in 16, and he'd all but given up actually on gardening because his son, having learnt how to fight for freedom, had gone off into Jerusalem's old city and stabbed an Israeli soldier at Jaffa Gate in the old Jerusalem walls, old city walls, and was shot dead by the Israeli Defense Force. As a punitive measure, his house and garden was set to be destroyed. Israel comes down very strongly, very tightly on anyone who is who creates an act of terror against the state of Israel. So one person commits something and the whole family is punished. And so this garden that had been the source of joy, relief, kind of resistance, was to be no more. Interestingly, a couple of days later, I met Millie, and she was one of these illegal settlers in Kiryat Arba, which is a settlement just outside Hebron. Hebron's a very sort of another divided place. She was a really lovely lady. She's a 1950s housewife. The house smelt of baking, and she was in the garden in denims, and she's a Chicago English teacher. Moved to Israel when she was 20 years ago with her family, because it was easier to live as a Jew in Israel than it was to live in Chicago in terms of the holidays and the clothes and the food and just religious observances. And she was, nice to talk to. Her garden was nothing special. It was quite dense, but I thought there's a Jewish practice called Shemitah, which is leaving land fallow for a year every 6 or 7 years in order for it to sort of regenerate itself. And I thought that she maybe had been observing Shemitah, but actually as we were talking, she was helping my translator figure out some of the names of plants in Hebrew that she couldn't translate into English. And then she suddenly said, as I was sort of about to leave, and she said, "Oh, I think if you're writing about gardens, you should know that this garden became really important to me when my son died." And it turned out that her son had been leaving the settlement and some Palestinians threw stones at him. He veered off the road and crashed, killing himself and his 2-year-old son, leaving behind a pregnant widow. And she said, losing a child is the hardest thing in the world, and that's why I garden. It helps me to grieve. And when I'm here, I'm filled with sunshine, even if it's dark. Anyway, I hope it's helpful for you to understand. A mother of 2, a 2-year-old, and I have a 6-month-old, so I really do understand that. And I just find it extraordinary that these two people have such similar reasons to why the garden is important, and yet, they will despise each other. Hebron, which is just where the settlement is close to, is a city divided. The West Bank is divided into A, B, and C. Hebron is H1 and H2. One side is administered by the Israeli, the other the Palestinians. Unfortunately, the largest side administered by the Israelis is where many Palestinians live. And it's the main thoroughfare called Al Shahada Street, which is like the Oxford Street or the Princes Street for Scotland, of the city, is completely cut off to most Palestinians. Now this is Zuleika. She lives on Al Shahada Street. This is a balcony overlooking the street. You can see the Star of David flags hanging from the walls just behind her. She, in order for her she can't access her own front door. To reach her house, you have to go through a network of alleyways and other people's roof terraces and gardens, because this is what the barricades look like for the Palestinians living in the street. She is an English teacher and a tour guide, a nursery teacher and a tour guide. And she continues to garden on this balcony despite the dangers of settlers climbing into her balcony, climbing into her apartment and threatening her, which has happened. The shadows on the wall behind her are of rocks that were thrown at her. But she continues to garden in plain sight. And some of the settlers in Hebron are really quite nasty. If you've got the inclination, Google it, Hebron settlers, and you'll see some extraordinary nasty things happening. But she continues to garden because to garden shows that we're not beaten. That's what she said. I'll finish on a more positive note. The most positive person I met was Offa Grunwald, who is a bonsai specialist, originally hailing from Pennsylvania. And he spent his summers, instead of going to summer camp, he was sent to the kibbutz and the moshavim on the border with Gaza, funnily enough. And he got into bonsai quite late. He had his own translation business and decided to specialize in bonsai in his 20s, having found a book that he made his parents buy in Pennsylvania when he was younger. And there's a long chapter about him in War Gardens, but what I love about what he was doing was the roots are in front of him in this photograph. They are some of them are 2,000 or 3,000 years old, and they're from their roots that are from olive groves torn up in the West Bank. From settlers, basically, from construction sites. And he wanted to really work with, because a lot of the settlers, when they go into Palestinian villages, if they take up, they often dig up incredibly ancient olive groves, and they just end up being firewood, which is, for him, is a real tragedy. But he likes to sort of reignite life into some of these old roots. And he understood really that to garden is to harness time, because trees will always outlive us if we treat them rightly. But of course, there's one last gardener, forgive me, who's on the front cover. He's a very amusing chap called Mohammed. He claimed to be 105 when I met him in 2012, but he also claimed to remember elephants and the Queen. So it's still unclear whether he's actually 105 years old. He worked in the ruins of the palace, the Jerusalem Palace, which you can see behind him. He was employed by the Afghan army to have a kitchen garden. Unlike the Americans and the Brits or the NATO soldiers, the Afghans live much more on the land. And he decided to take some seeds from home and plant the flowers that you see behind him. It wasn't a beautiful garden, it was quite scraggly, but it was very much his passion. And he said that when you garden in a garden like that, you're in paradise. Everything that you see is in paradise. And the soldiers behind him, the soldiers next to him, used to say that green is happiness and green is peace. I think in 7 years of working on War Gardens as a photographic project, I met over 150 gardeners in just a few countries. I went to Eastern Ukraine as well, but it's not very relevant for Asia, Scotland. They are ordinary people, just like everyone, just like anyone tuning into this webinar, and they're just trying to live against something extraordinary. And what I found rather amazing about them is the strength of conviction that they had to keep creating life when everything around them was being destroyed. And I think Monet understood this, and it's really, these gardens really remind me that life goes on, and especially in a time like now when we have this awful pandemic, that life really does go on. And when I read a lot of literature when I was writing War Gardens, including lots of children's literature, read a bit of Milton, read lots and lots of First World War poetry because they loved nature. And I wanted to try and understand why gardening is so important when really we're largely urban dwellers now. But of course, the first garden is Eden, if religious from Eden. And I wonder that when we look at all these wars around us and maybe this pandemic, you think, well, maybe we're still falling. And I thought, no, that can't be right, because there are people still gardening. Then I thought, well, maybe the people gardening in times of conflict are regaining some of the innocence of previous time, like Ramesh in the walled garden with his birds and his fruit. Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in.
Lally, thank you very much indeed for taking us on that journey. But Lally, can I just start off? You were talking a lot about Afghanistan for understandable reasons. What is the Taliban's attitude towards gardening? Can you comment on that?
Well, funny enough, yes, absolutely. I went down to Helmand to speak to the Taliban about their gardens, because I was aware that there was a chap I spoke to in Kabul. He was working in Afghanistan in the 80s, and he said the Taliban had the most amazing rose gardens, and that at the airstrip, when you'd go to, he was working for the UN, under the Red Cross, and when you turn up at various airstrips to take flights around the country, the Taliban were much more interested in their rose gardens than they were looking at his papers. I went down to see, I met a couple of people working for the Taliban, and they were kind of nominally dangerous, but they taken arms and fought against the British and the Americans. And the reason was simply because the Pashtun hadn't been observed. They, as far as they were concerned, people had turned up unannounced, walked over their fields, walked over their gardens, and Afghans have big orchards, without asking, and they were rightly a little bit miffed. And that was the reason for many of the people that I interviewed who'd fought against the British in Helmand. And I know that religiously in the Quran, there's a line that if you want to see God, give a gift of a rose to your neighbor. Many mosques have gardens. One of the mullahs that I met, who was a Taliban mullah, who was surprisingly kind and lovely, but he was too poor actually to have a proper mosque garden. But he just sort of had a sort of scrubbery of sort of grass outside his mosque. This was in a tiny village in the middle of Helmand. But yeah, they have a very positive attitude to gardening, frankly.
Yeah, I would have thought so. Good.
Very interesting, Lalage. I think the incredible power of nature, I think, shows how people can forget their worries and the sadness which is happening. But I wanted to ask whether there's been any sharing of ideas in terms of building a peace garden or park where people can meet and discuss their, sorrows, and also look towards the future for a more settled and happier and united future for humanity. Thank you.
You mean with regards to Afghanistan, or?
Well, I think in all your travels and in terms of places of conflict, especially, has there been any?
Sure. I think. Well, I know that I didn't cover this I ran out of money. I wanted to do it, but I couldn't. In Beirut, there is a peace garden specifically for that reason. It was built in downtown Beirut in Solidaire, on one of the front lines of the green zone. So that the idea is very much there. In Afghanistan, there are lots of public parks and gardens that the Aga Khan and other institutions have been involved in sort of renovating, and some Afghans don't have gardens, and it's a lovely place to go of a weekend. And Bagi Babur, the Emperor Babur's gardens in Kabul was full, whether sunny or summer or winter, was always full of Afghans, just sort of a bit like you might do in London. You might go to Richmond Park or Battersea Park or something like that. I haven't spoken about Ukraine. In Gaza, no, although the Commonwealth Cemetery, he's one of my gardeners because it's an incredible swathe of land that is unpopulated. But the guy who runs it is very nervous about letting people in because it's such an untouched piece of land. And land, unfortunately, in Gaza and in Israel is such a commodity that I'm not really aware of there being any direct things. Although the botanical gardens in Jerusalem, where I met the bonsai specialist, but again, it's in Jerusalem, not in a contentious place. But I know there's a lot of solidarity between gardeners, and that's one thing I found, is that gardeners are incredibly generous people. It doesn't really matter which side of the coin your political allegiances might be. At the end of the day, if you want to share some tomato seeds with a fellow gardener, that seems to be much more important than whether they are Russian rebels or Taliban fighters.
What about medicinal plants? I mean, is there a scope there or they might be already looking into that? I mean, the locals with all this indigenous knowledge.
That's very true. I don't know in Afghanistan. I know in the West Bank, I met quite a lot of people who are involved in permaculture. And permaculture is when you have your entire ecosystem within your garden, basically. And there was one chap I met he and his wife ran a permaculture farm, and they were gathering seeds, and they had basically a seed bank in a shed, and it was remarkable to look at because they were taking species that thought they were going to die out. I don't know whether they're medicinal or not, but that's I'm sure there's scope for doing that. But as I said at the very beginning of the talk, I'm not a gardener, sadly. Otherwise, I'd be doing this.
Thank you.
Lalage, can I just ask you a question? Because I know that Sally Coulthard's on this call, and she might not switch her mic on, but gardening as a therapy for people who've been through conflict, and you started conflict issues in terms of helping solve issues of post-traumatic stress and other things. Though not a gardener, as you say, you are obviously there an observer of people. Did you see changes? And perhaps even before that, Sally could explain, hi Sally, what she is doing now using gardens, and I've heard of people also using archaeology to help people in post-conflict environments. Sally?
Thank you, Roddy. Hello, Lala. Thank you very much. A really inspiring talk and so many little bits and pieces that I'd like to follow up with you later. I don't know if Roddy's mentioned prior to the meeting, but I'm developing a nationwide network of enabling gardens. Well, I'm working with gardens that exist to deliver a 10-week horticultural therapy program, which I've designed based on research that I did through a Churchill Fellowship in Scandinavia and the States. So we are finding that it makes, we can produce consistent improvements in both common mental health, anxiety and disorder and depression, as well as PTSD, which I'm sure you've come across.
Absolutely. I know when I was researching a lot of this, a lot of the things while I was photographing and then latterly while I was writing it, I think it's been proven that there's, I can never pronounce the word, but it's microbicillium something or other in soil that is a known endorphin enhancer. So if you literally get your hands in the soil, it can alleviate all sorts of depressions and unease and anxieties. I've met lots of people. I mean, I'm now stumped because over 150 gardeners and not one is springing to my head, but there are millions of them, well, 150 of them, because I think when you're gardening in a place like, whether it's Afghanistan or Ukraine or Gaza or the West Bank, I think turning the other cheek to what's going on around you is key. And I think that's what a lot of people treating anxiety and depression would say, is like when you turn the other cheek to it, you just switch it off. And I've noticed since moving to Dorset from Afghanistan, I've noticed really quite loving the seasons. Well, I hate winter, I really hate it. But I know that in 6 months' time, we'll be turning forward and there'll be bulbs springing up. And that I think is something that's really, really key for anyone with PTSD. I think is like looking forward and not being too stuck in the past. But yeah, I'd love to speak to you more later about this because I think it's very interesting.
Thank you, that would be super. Thank you, Roddy.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing your stories. And I have to say, a very exciting and adventurous life you've been leading compared to the prosaic one that I certainly, and perhaps most of the rest of us, have led. I wondered, therefore, for you, sort of what's next? I mean, obviously you've got young children now, but what do you think is next in terms of your projects and where you go from here?
I'm trying to write a novel, and I say trying because I have been trying to write it for about 10 years. And it turns out that it's quite hard. But yes, I have 2 very small children, and time seems to fritter itself away very, very quickly at the moment. I don't think I could really say much beyond that, because I think when you do have children and you've been doing dangerous things, although sometimes I think, oh God, take me back, your responsibilities and change somewhat. And even I've got to go to London next week, and that will be the 3rd night I've ever spent away from my 2-year-old son. So I'm even kind of hugely anxious about that. So as for what holds the future, but also who knows what's going to happen with, I think the way the world is changing, the way people will sort of continue to report will change. News reporting. So I don't know.
Well, I'm sure you've got a lot more things to achieve. So thanks again for today's talk.
Thanks for your question.
Quick question. Obviously you've been to a lot of extraordinary places. Granted, also you've got a young family. But is there another location or war zone that you'd like to go to where you know there are extraordinary gardens in extraordinary circumstances?
Oh gosh, so many. When I was first hashing out the idea of war gardens, I wrote a list, and I'm not joking, it was about that long, of countries where I knew there were gardens. Not democratic, Central African Republic, Kashmir, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is in the news right now. Nagorno-Karabakh actually means black garden or black soil, I forget which. Huge gardens there. And then Iraq, I read a story in the New York Times, probably around 10 years ago actually, but about how people returning to Baghdad from having lived abroad were creating topiary box hedges in their gardens, a la kind of like white picket fenced American style ornamental gardens. But I think that's what's the great thing about the garden as a lens, because you can take the term to be as minute or as large as you want, but ultimately if you have a pot and a seed, that's a garden. So yes, where else would there be? I also thought about doing something along the border in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, closer to home. But yeah, throw a dart in any of the conflicts around the world and you'll find gardens there.
Thank you.
Now, it's worth pointing out, since I live in America half the time, that after 9/11, the British community in New York created the British Garden, which is kind of a square there, and that, although not in a rural area, but in a city, was a means of creating a space where people could go and sit and think about those that they'd known who died, and as a way, I think, of restoring their thinking. And of course, who was it who said, I think it was Dr. Johnson, that the parks of London are the lungs of London, in the same way, this creation of an environment where people can, recover.
Well, I think that was what's really extraordinary about the Helmand garden in Lashkar and many of the forward operating bases. There was a forward operating base in Sangin called Fob Jackson, where the Afghans working there created a geranium garden, which was quite remarkable. But what was always, and I worked for a time for NATO and at ISAF HQ in Kabul, there were two gardens. One was called the Distill Garden and one was called I actually forget what the other one was called because I was never allowed in it. But the idea being that a garden was a place, even as a soldier, to go and sit and be calm and to remove yourself into nature for a few moments.
Thoughts just come to my mind. Obviously, you have seen a lot of these gardens in unlikely places, and people doing the gardening for soothing their minds or soothing their bodies or whatever that might be. Is there a predominance of pretty flowers and that kind of stuff, or are they more practical in terms of growing fruit and veg? So that's my first question. And
okay.
And my very quickly, my second question is, and this is a thought, that I mean, talking of therapeutic effect or the peaceful feeling of being in a garden. A lot of our NHS hospitals have huge parking lots, but no gardens at all. They have absolutely humongous parking lots, but no gardens. Could they all convert themselves to multi-storied car parks and have a huge garden instead in all the NHS hospitals? And that will be a therapy for patients. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I'll ask your second point. I think would be excellent. Sadly, I think that the income produced by car parks and for hospitals far outweighs the use than a garden in terms of financial gain. Having had many a battle with my local hospital car park, I knew this to be true. But I think that would be a fantastic idea. I have no idea how one would go about doing that. But yes, it's sad that gardens are seen to be the preserve of kind of the rich or people with too much time on their hands or something. Like it's a complete no-brainer that you could just take the top floor of a car park and turn it into a garden. But I don't know if you're working for the NHS, but I think you should definitely suggest that. In terms of the prevalence of one plant over another, not really. It was quite varied. In Afghanistan, Afghans garden on the traditional Mughal gardens were the paradise gardens, and there would be all sorts of different plants in there for shade, for fruit, for fire. There were water channels, but often ornamental gardens. And in Baghi Babur, the Babur's gardens in Kabul, there were all sorts of beautiful, there was cosmos, zinnia, rudbeckia, roses, not quite Ami, but beautiful sort of cowslippy type things, and sunflowers. And the more private gardens, people would favour the geranium because they grow everywhere and they're easy to grow. Roses that are indigenous to Afghanistan, and tulips as well that are indigenous to bits of Afghanistan. In the south, it was more roses and vines because they were climbers, and then whatever crops there were. But again, a variety of things for food, but also for beauty. In places like Ukraine, they were, funnily enough, more vegetable orientated. When the war broke out in Ukraine, people started to return to the old ways of gardening, and had to kind of grow and live off the land rather than relying on the imports and supermarkets. In Gaza, Gaza and the West Bank, the settlers often had plastic grass, which I thought was hilarious. And again, geraniums and roses were favoured. But again, it was kind of, I guess, the settlers in the kibbutz communities, they were much more ornamental. Than in Gaza was more practical. And in the West Bank, we had the permaculture places, permaculture farms, and the cactus was actually, funnily enough, was used by both sides of the coin for both settlers and Palestinians. The cactus was the symbol of being rootless, and how you can, because you can take a bud of a cactus, plonk it on some sand, and pretty much let it root on its own. And so both sides would get very excited about the symbolism of that. But really a real variety of ornamental or food stuffs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Lalage. Thank you very much for what was a beautiful and thought-provoking presentation. To what extent do you think gardening is a major way of maintaining hope? My thought is that it may be a way of demonstrating one's agency to oneself as a way of still having hope.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think I really think that to garden is to harness time, and it is to look forward. You can be in the middle of chaos, but hold a bulb in your hand and know that when you plant it in the ground, in a few months' time, something will grow from it. And that's really the essence of possibly why lots of people garden in these places of conflict. But also how, I don't know about in the US, but in the last couple of months, garden is sort of, everyone's gone mental for their gardens because they've been stuck at home, and it's a way of looking forward and to know that, I mean, I've got a bunch, I hate winter, as I said, and I've got a bunch of bulbs that I bought from the garden centre in a slight sort of panic buying sort of frame of mind with a 2-year-old going mad. And I can't wait to plant them because winter is literally closing in. But in 6 months' time, I'll have a couple of quite pretty flowers. Don't know what they are, but I can't wait to see them.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that. Well, I think we've reached the stage now where our hour is up, and it only leaves me with the pleasant pleasure of thanking Lalage so much for communicating with us from another most beautiful part, at least till the winter comes in, as you said, of Great Britain, namely Dorset, hardy country, I guess, right?
Yeah.
After author. And I, as we've listened to you, I've been thinking about how in all of the different cultures of the world, and especially across the whole range of the Asian countries, gardening and growing things is such a critical and interesting component. We think of the Japanese and their gardens, and all the other great civilizations of China and of course of India, marvelous gardens everywhere which enable people to express their feelings and bring comfort and reassurance at, as I was mentioned at the beginning, this very troubled time for everybody. So the glory of the garden is indeed a real thing. And Lalage, thank you so much for having brought it alive to us in your words and in your photographs and in your stories. And we are truly very grateful to you and for those who've asked questions and the many people who've been listening in on this webinar. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real honor and a privilege. Thank you so much.